Well, we'll go ahead and get started then. And let me just begin. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Lift up your hearts.
Lift up
To the Lord.
Let us give thanks to the Lord our God.
It is right to give God thanks and praise.
It is right. A joyous thing, even after a week off, right? And we're here this week, and we are not here next week. Are we recording? Yeah, we are. Okay, good. Then you will be presenting then the following week. Okay. I think I've posted this 2 or 3 times through announcements, so you can go back and revisit those. But just a reminder, this is the last week. One way to think about it, this is the last week of content other than the content you generate going forward. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end of today's presentation. But if you posted your your idea and working bibliography, those of you who did, I actually responded to those. I actually commented on those on Zoom. So as far as I'm concerned, at this point, everything else is sort of left up to you when it comes to that. And we'll just play that by ear going forward. Okay, I'll take time for questions toward the end of class instead of now. All right. Rachel Hubel is not here. Well, her name is, but she's not. Holly's not here.
Yeah. I don't know why. I talked to her earlier, but she never said anything about that.
Okay, it's like take a week off and everybody's ready for Christmas at this point.
Well,
Right?
it's probably because we got our 20-page paper due this week for
Dr. Wesley. Yeah.
Dr. Wesley
So people are stressing over that.
Okay, so he's got the paper before Thanksgiving.
Yes.
And I've got the paper after Thanksgiving.
Yes.
Okay. Well, we know who's the more Christian in that conversation at the same place. Okay. So it's probably good you don't have both at the same time.
Yes.
And historically at NTS, that used to be more the standard. You'd have 3 or 4 major papers all due the same week. So maybe we need to get that back online just so that way you don't have anything early or late. They just all arrive exactly on the same day.
I think that's a wonderful idea.
I like it.
Okay. And Rachel Hugh just joined and says, what's going on? So let me read to you a passage out of John. And I read it earlier this morning. I meant to put my bookmark in it.
Yeah, my phone.
It was me.
Okay. Let me get my phone was off. Thank goodness.
Well, let's save that one for the end. This is this morning. Just kidding. Okay. I'm gonna have to. Okay, wait. Oh, come on. There it 26. Okay, sorry about that. It took just a little bit longer than I thought. This is John chapter 12, 20 through 26. So let me read this to you from Nubian, and we'll take time for prayer requests and prayer afterwards, okay? Now, among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and said to him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew went with Philip, and they told Jesus. And Jesus answered them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. And if it dies, it bears much fruit. He who loves his life or her life loses it, and he or she who hates his or her life for this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, they must follow me, and where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him or her." Nubian writes, he says, presumably the procession had come to its end in the outer precincts of the temple. So this is kind of Jesus's movement into Jerusalem. And caught up in this tumultuous demonstration of national religious enthusiasm were some Gentiles, not of the Jewish race, but not necessarily proselytes, but God-fearers, drawn to Jerusalem, as were many, very many Gentiles, by the attractive power of Israel's faith. I think most of you know that kind of background to the Gentiles, God-fearers. It says naturally they would like to have an interview with such a remarkable person as Jesus evidently is. Naturally also they would make their contact through Philip, a man with a Greek name coming from a Gentile territory. So at the very height of this surge of Jewish messianic excitement, Jesus is told that Gentiles are coming to him. An observer might think that the Jesus wave was really going to sweep from Jerusalem into the whole world, but it's not so. The saving work of God, by which the ruler of this world is cast out and all peoples are brought to their true home in God, will not be the linear extension either of Jewish religious enthusiasm or Greek intellectual curiosity. There is no straight road from these to God and his glory. Rather, there is a radical discontinuity of which the natural world provides a vivid parable. In the Synoptic Gospels, the seed which must fall into the ground before there would be a harvest is a parable of the kingdom, and you'll find that in Mark 4, 1 through 20. Some of you might remember that passage. But it is Jesus himself who is in his own person is the presence of the kingdom, and it is he, therefore, who must, like a grain of wheat, fall, die, and be buried. Only so can the mighty harvest of the nations be gathered. And the hour when this must happen is now present. The coming of the Gentile inquirers is a token of its presence. But their desire to see Jesus will not be fulfilled in the way they expect, just as the Jewish crowds who cry out the greeting to the King of Israel will find that his kingdom is utterly different from their expectations. In fact, the revealing of the glory of God will be in his dying, and both Jews and Gentiles will cooperate in putting him to death. But his death will be the true glorifying of the Son of Man, because in it, God will be glorified. That the crucifixion of a man should be the ultimate manifestation of the glory of God is as scandalous to the Jewish religious messianism as it is absurd to Greek philosophy. But it is true. For the glory of God is the outpouring of love which is supremely revealed in the obedience of Jesus to death and in the action of the Father who gives his only Son for the life of the world and sustains him to the end in his obedience. Nubian closes this section. He goes on for a while, and he finally says, to the one who is willing to follow Jesus in this freely willed love and obedience, there is the promise of abiding fellowship with him and of sharing with him in the honor which the Father bestows on him. To the servant of Jesus, to be a servant of Jesus means to follow him on the way to the cross, and in doing so, to abide in him, Jesus. The full meaning of this abiding in Jesus and in the Father will be spelled out later in the final discourses of the upper room. That's John chapters 14 through 16. It is briefly defined here in the terms of a stark paradox, which mirrors the paradox of the cross. It is a life which is not guarded and preserved, but forever thrown away. Yet it is a life constantly received out of the fresh gift from the source of all life, and whose eternally outpoured love it has assurance that death has lost its dominion. Leslie Newbegin. Hi, Holly. It's good to see you. Excuse me. Prayer request.
I was late.
That's okay. That's okay. You're on time, so that's the main thing. Prayer request. Any concerns or needs? Oh, yeah.
I will just update everybody because I don't think I told the ending of the story. I was diagnosed with ADHD and I do have medicine.
Okay.
So I'm hoping everybody can see that I'm calmer and I can focus more. So
Okay.
I didn't want to leave everybody hanging.
Okay. Well, thanks be to God for that.
Yeah.
So,
My mom is coming to visit us on Thursday and she's going to fly. So pray for her safety.
we will do that. She's flying alone.
Yes, she's coming, so we have a time of renewal for both of us.
Okay,
together.
very good. Well, I'm looking forward to that for you. I know you have a few little things to do in light of the class also coming up at the same time. So I'll pray for balance and grace in the midst of that visit, to say the least. Okay. Any other requests? Yeah.
I feel like I'm facing my first kind of major challenge in ministry at First Church. I lead the young adult group there. There's a husband and wife. The wife, she's from the Ukraine, and her parents both had COVID, and her mom got better, but her dad was not getting better. And she was going to go to the Ukraine, but the day before her flight left, her dad had a heart attack and died. And so she's gone at the Ukraine. She left right away, and her husband, and she's going to be gone till like January 15th or something. So a really long time. And her husband has been a really good friend of mine, and she's going to be gone for all the holidays and his birthday and all this stuff. And on top of that, the grief of losing someone to COVID and everything. It's trying to figure out how to be there for both of them in a way, whatever way I need to.
Anastasia?
Yeah, Nastia. Yeah.
Not Nasia.
Yeah.
And
Tim and Nastia.
Tim.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right, thanks. Anything else? No? Okay. Well, let's pray. All right. Gracious God, we do thank you for, the gift of your son, Jesus, the scandal, and yet the promise of the grace of God in and through the good news of the gospel. That again just reminds us once more, just speaks across the fullness of human expectation in radically different ways and calls us to live in a radically different way as well. And we do thank you for the good news of that gospel and the challenge embedded within that. Thankful for Tara. I'm glad she is on medication as well, and just pray, Lord, through the administrations of doctors and the application of medication, that it just helps her in the fullness of her life, both as a student, but also in just making a life and the myriad intersections that she's engaged in as well. Just pray this will give a new perspective for her as she moves forward, both in this class and also just while here in Kansas City. So just be with her. for Paula as she is waiting her mother. We do pray for traveling mercies and for any alleviation of anxiety. But also pray, Lord, that you would prepare Paula in such a way that when her mom arrives, this will be a time of deep, deep connection and celebration. Just pray that you would be with the family. In light of the previous loss, that the time together would be a time of restoration, as well as probably the continuation of grief, but in such a way that the fullness of, a mother's love for her daughter and the same in return would just mirror the fullness of your love and work in both their lives. Nick, for Stasia, as she travels in the midst of a very painful time, in the midst of a loss of a father, a circumstance that we are mindful of that have been a part of this narrative of the class prior to this. We do pray you be with her as she rejoins family, and that this extended time away would be a time of healing and bonding within the family. But we do pray for Tim as he is here, particularly through the holidays, recognizing as, still relative newlyweds, that they're still early in their marriage and that this kind of time away could indeed be a time of mourning and loss. So we just pray, Lord, that you be with Tim in the midst of this time, be with Nick in his ministry to both, but particularly to Tim as a friend. And just pray, Lord, that your good grace would be at work throughout that circumstance. Mindful that there are others not here today. I know Michael is struggling with a sore neck. Not sure about Trevin and JJ, but just know that this time of the year is a time of stress, already named as papers that are coming due as early as this week, and the inevitability of other papers that continue to come due over the next few weeks. Just pray, Lord, that you would provide the kind of gracious space and the wisdom that's needed to navigate the end of the semester. Knowing we're not together next week, pray that during this period of time that we sometimes allude to as Thanksgiving, but also as Advent, that we would feel the fullness of your grace here in the United States, but also the expectation of Christmas in and through the Advent season, that it would rest afresh and anew upon each and every one of us. Ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Okay. Well, we'll keep going. And so is Tim going to move in with you, Nick? Is that the whole idea? It's nothing but pizza for the next
exactly.
2.5 months? Is that the whole thing? I wasn't going to say that and pray for you, but after I prayed, knowing some of the family, I could go, this could be like serial football games and pizza for 6 weeks. So get your papers done first, okay?
Yeah.
I don't want to hear that you OD'd on pepperoni pizza.
I did go to a Chinese food buffet with him the other day.
Okay. And you're still able to walk. This is good news.
Exactly.
So, okay. All right. We're going to spend some time today first talking about evangelism after pluralism, and then talking a little bit about the 3 books. And what I was hoping to do is do that in small group, but there are several people missing, so we'll just kind of play that one by ear. Does that make sense? I hope, I know it probably felt a little bit like, and I'll use a different phrase that is very true to the U.S., kind of a mad scramble when it came to navigating all the forums during the time that we did not meet last week, because you had 3 different assignments over that period of time and 3 different forums to post in. I created the announcement so that you would have the links, but I know it just doesn't always work that well or that easily. So just to name that. I will be reviewing those, and that will be a part of class participation. So you just need to hear the fact that we don't meet didn't mean there weren't assignments that had to be addressed and taken care of during that period. Okay. And I'll probably treat them as this was a window, this is when it was supposed to be done, and now we're moving on again from this standpoint. All right. One way to kind of talk about today's class is actually to take you back about 5 years ago, just to kind of locate me in the midst of the presentation that I'm doing. There was about 5 years ago this past summer, I guess the best way to say it, so pre-COVID, when I had the opportunity to travel to Moscow and Volgograd to teach. It was one of those times where through the good graces of EUNC, European Nazarene College, that they had invited me to go over and teach some of the Russian ministers in the course of study, their ordination path. And it gave me an opportunity to visit both Volgograd, which is previously known as Stalingrad, as well as Moscow as a part of the journey. And some of you may know Davida Contarella. Tanya and Davida were hosts of mine, and Davida was a consummate guide. So as he took me around, he filled me in on all the Russian history behind it. And I was struck by and I guess the best way to say it is less the Soviet history as the Russian history, and how deeply that is connected to basically, particularly World War II, where as in one site I visited, there was not a county in Russia that was not directly affected by massive loss of life during the war. We tend to remember the war here in the United States as a place we went to fight. For them, it was fighting on the homeland, particularly. And if anyone has ever seen, I'm not necessarily recommending the movie, but if you've ever seen the movie Enemy Behind the Gate, it's the kind of total destruction of Stalingrad during that period of time is pretty amazing. And so they have a statue, instead of a Statue of Liberty, they have a statue of Mother Russia in Volgograd. They have a massive memorial to those who died during that war, several of those. But then when I went to Moscow, I discovered I did visit the Kremlin and Red Square. And one thing that fascinated me was that they have in the Kremlin 5 churches that is sort of the church square. They're all Russian Orthodox churches. And while I was there, what was really kind of amazing was at the same time I was there, they had a military exercise and parade, kind of a drum and bugle corps kind of thing, happening right in the courtyard in the midst of these 5 different churches, almost looking down on it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So those were some just kind of amazing experiences, albeit visiting that country. And I have to be honest with you, coming to terms with the depth of the pain of what that country went through during World War II helped me to kind of understand a little bit more about who Russians were during that period of time and how they tend to see the world. But the thing I found equally was we took time to visit the Cathedral of Christ our Savior. And no, this is not so much a slideshow. I've done those in the past. I just don't want to bore you that long. But the Cathedral of Christ our Savior was a giant cathedral that was built and then ravaged. It was literally leveled. And the ground that it sat on was converted into a giant swimming pool that was kind of a tribute to Soviet progressive thinking. And then later, as the Soviet Union was beginning to decline, actually the Russian Orthodox Church petitioned and they filled in the swimming pool and they rebuilt the entire cathedral. And it is amazing. You can go online and Google. I took exterior pictures. The interior ones you see there are things I borrowed right off of Google as well. They discourage you taking pictures inside. But what I found interesting is there's actually a cathedral within a cathedral or a chapel that's a part of the main floor. And there's this big area out in front where they have within Russia, they have an incredible Christmas service, Russian Orthodox, but it's a Christmas service. And what I noticed was there was this one little bench over to one side that was pretty ornate. And I finally asked David, I said, what is that for? And he said, well, that's where basically the president, used to be the emperor, would come and sit and preside. And he says, now this is where the president, so this is where Putin comes every Christmas and sits in the middle of this Christmas service. And that was, I hope you hear, for an outsider looking in, to hear this deep political history, and then see the wedding of that with the Russian Orthodox Church. It was very clear to me, but it also was very clear to me that from within Russian culture, this would just be natural from that standpoint. I hope that makes sense. Some of you who are in Eastern Europe or from Eastern Europe recognize this better than we would here. But the sort of the amalgam between the history of the country, its endurance in the midst of hardship, the presence of the church, and the presence of leadership, political and military leadership, are all woven together. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And it's awful easy for me as an outsider to kind of spot that, partially, I think, because of readings. But it really began for me to ask questions about, what about the United States? Everybody with me? And how is it that this plays out here in the U.S. the same way? I will tell you a funny story, so don't get me in trouble on this one. It is being recorded, so I can get in trouble. I was actually a consultant to the creation of the Museum of the Bible on a science and Bible conversation. So I got to fly out to Washington, D.C. when they were building the Museum of the Bible. You guys have heard about that, haven't you? Here in the U.S., there's this museum dedicated to the Bible, that was created, partially funded by the Hobby Lobby crowd, but others as well. And we were there to kind of think about the relationship between the Bible and science in the U.S. What was funny was they were building at the time, one of two motion theaters, where when you get into the seats, you feel like you're flying, all that kind of stuff. And it was one of only two of its kind in the United States when it was being built. The other one's at one of the theme parks. And their vision was, what they envisioned they would do is that they would put you in it almost like being on a magic carpet. I don't think they would want to use that language. This is my language. I mean, this is about Museum of the Bible, so stay with me. And they envisioned flying you all over Washington and then visiting all the monuments and looking for the inscribed Bible verses under each one of those monuments, and kind of showing the pervasiveness of the Bible in Washington, D.C. There was only one very slight problem. None of those monuments had any Bible passages. So now they were stuck. What are they going to do with this? It was, again, just one of those kind of moments that reminded me that how we wed culture and Christianity is something that we all wrestle with from one location to the next. Does that make sense? This has been this experience, which was beautiful. I have to say, the pastors, the ministers I were with were just incredible. I don't think I've ever had quite that kind of a unique experience bonding with people. Of course, it was Moscow's one thing. Volgograd's a little more what we call rural country. In some ways, Volgograd reminds me more of Kansas than it does DC. But the kind of real love for Christ and the love that people had in the church, I think, was pretty amazing. So I really want you to hear, this is not meaning any human beings I was ministering with. That was actually probably one of the best experiences I've had. Not to put down anything here at NTS, it was just a radically different experience. But it did teach me something about how culture and Christianity get wedded together regardless. Which takes us to Evangelism After Pluralism, that book. Okay. Some of you posted online, some of you didn't get a chance to. So in a word, how would you summarize Brian Stone's thesis? I'm not asking you to go and find the right page and read it to us, but kind of what is Stone trying to accomplish in the book Evangelism After Pluralism. If you were somebody to say, you mean you had to read that book? So what's it about? How would you kind of characterize it? Not caricature it, but characterize Stone's agenda? Sorry, you're going, I read that 2 weeks ago. What do you mean? I got to 4:30. I don't know about you. So how would you characterize it? Holly?
Well, he just basically was talking about Christian witness in the world and well, I mean the ethics of it. Basically, like how do you ethically witness without coercing people or well, I'm kind of not forming my thoughts here, but
Okay. No, I have been fair. Most of the time I've lectured in class, so I want to name that. But this is one time I just kind of want to get you be processing about the book at the same time. So it's okay, and I think you're on the right track. So, so that's a good answer. You guys know when the professor plays the game, can you guess what I'm thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not trying to do that at this point. So I'm just kind of getting us all kind of thinking about the book, not thinking about the right answer. Yeah.
I think with the book, he's trying to answer the question of can there be or what is the effect that Christianity's ties to imperialism has had on the Christian witness?
Okay.
And what does a Christian witness look like going forward from that context, in those contexts where it has historically been tied to imperialism?
Okay. Yeah. So that he does have in mind certain contexts that shape the way that has tended to happen and what difference it make when we take those into account and even try to resist those from that standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? Yeah, Paula?
I don't want to offend anybody by saying this, but to me, as I was reading this was a lot of information that I did not know about USA. But to me, it seems that it was evangelism for the white America. For the I'm not sure how to say that, but really in the white community more.
Okay. And it could well, Paul, you could be well right. I mean, his interlocutors would be, knowing Brian's background, actually would be predominantly white, Protestant. I'd even dare to say evangelical, just based on his early history of what he grew up.
I didn't want to say that, but that's what I wanted to say.
And kind of how that vision of North American, or just name it USA, evangelism, what that looks like is part of what he's trying to have a conversation with. So yes, that's a fair assessment from that standpoint. Anything else? Let me add this other piece. Why would he want to bring ethics into the conversation? Why was that important for him?
Because you don't want to scare people. And I mean, in the sense that you don't want to scare them if they're going to hell, so they might as well get fire insurance.
So to avoid certain kinds of models. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and he may have more than just that version of it, but that would be one of the things is sort of the way in which we evangelize might in some ways subvert the very good news of the gospel as a result of the very method by which we do that. Mm-hmm. Other thoughts?
Kind of in the American context, and I also am reading a lot about this as I start to research for my research paper, but in the church growth and everything, it's not like talking about how evangelism isn't about mass producing converts, so which has kind of been, it's deeply ingrained in American Christianity, just producing converts, but instead he talks about like having an embodied witness and faithfully going about evangelism that way rather than for the production of converts.
Yeah, and we will unpack part of that in just a couple of minutes. But for him, evangelism is not so much about a point in time as it is a particular way of life, which I always find fascinating within a Wesleyan holiness conversation, because for us, I think it's a bit of a both and. That we tend to focus on a point in time, but we actually are hoping for a way of life. We just don't know always how well those go together in our tradition. And for him, the telos is the way of life. It's the beginning and the continuation of evangelism. That's important. Anything else? I'm not looking for a right answer, just to kind of get us back around Stone's writing. That's probably the best way to say it. Yeah, Paula?
I think for me was more why ethics is because evangelism, it is about ethics in a culture. Ethics is, it affects people, humanity. Therefore, that's why he chose to, we're talking about normal issues that the culture, our culture, USA, is facing, and how do we go about it?
Right. So that ethics in some ways describes the very nature of human relationship. And I think Brian would go bingo. That's one of the big pieces from his standpoint. One way to think about this book within what we've been trying to do in the class, we've talked about the Bible and missional theology. We've talked about systematic theology and missional theology. We've talked about church history and missional theology. And Stone sort of fits within this theological ethics in missional theology. And what's the relationship? Even though he doesn't use that word as often, definitely in this book, but it's saying this is another core conversation that missional theology has to participate in from that standpoint. Does that make sense? So one way to think about this, I'm deeply aware right now, Dr. Josh Sweden, even as I'm teaching, is teaching theological ethics. And we were chatting with each other, and it's kind of like, it's a good thing that they're not taking your class and my class side by side. That could drive people nuts this week. But in a way, this is sort of Dr. Sweden joining us for this conversation and bringing that deeply theologically minded ethical framework into this missional theology conversation. Does that make sense? And I think that is important because actually, and the reason I mentioned Newbegin here is, if you remember, and I know it probably feels like another universe at this point, but when we were reading Weston, it was very late in Weston's book when he started talking about the gospel and public life. And he began to think about the relationship between the culture and the dominant culture and missional theology, and how then should we act and treat each other, was also in Newbegin's work. Weston tends to put that at the end of the book. Does that make sense? So he gives us all the theology up front, and then how does that play itself out in the second half of the book as we engage culture? So the gospel, the first half, the culture, the second. The thing I think is important is, while the book is organized that way, I do think for Newbegin, even his impulse to want to sort of introduce missional theology, always had underneath it an ethical concern as well, because it is about human relationships. It's about the very people we call into the kingdom. And the way in which we relate to them as human beings is one of the key considerations and concerns. And in Newbegin, we might miss it because it doesn't show up everywhere. Even his language that we can't coerce people because the gospel never coerces people is, again, his theology of the gospel meeting the way that you relate with people. And so, in a way, Brian Stone is merely, one way to think about this book inside this class is he is merely extending Newbegin's agenda, but rather than talking about it in England during Bosnia-Herzegovina and the breakup of Yugoslavia and those kinds of painful experiences, or Rwanda. In other words, Newbigin writes with a particular vision of the world shaped by British and European and African culture that's at work underneath him. I mean, he's mindful of it. It's just part of his world as he's writing. When we get to Brian Stone, we get first time a gospel in our culture or USA culture kind of treatment. And so, Paula, I'll go back to your comment. As much as historically in the United States, it has been basically about white Protestant evangelicalism, Stone is a part of that matrix that he's trying to speak into. Does that make sense? And that doesn't invalidate him, it just names his context from there. And so he brings up 3 USA concerns. I mean, Newbigin might not have used these quite the same way, but this, I mean, if you remember in his book, he was thinking about postmodernism, he was thinking about consumerism, and so he had very specific things he was naming. And if you were reading that and finding you were glossing over it, well, that was because he was writing around 2000, right? And that's just so 2000. But Stone is really having a conversation with the USA in light of empire, nationalism, and yes, consumerism. Those become the pluralisms that he wants to address. That maybe the difference is in Weston, we got world religions, then we got that broader culture. In Stone, it goes the other way. You get the broader cultural norms and emphases, the pluralisms of the culture. And then it's not until later that he actually turns to the world religions in conversation. Okay?
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of a flip of this book compared to Newbigin, the way we experience Newbigin's writings. Now, if you read Leslie Newbigin, some of his books, not a compen, you'll get almost the same feel in the book that you're getting from Brian Stone. It's kind of spooky at times. Though they don't. Brian's not merely trying to mimic Leslie Newbigin, but it is kind of spooky in a way in which Newbigin writing in his day and what Stone is trying to write come pretty close to each other. They do have different visions of the gospel. I will say that, but it still is fairly interesting the way they're trying to do their work. To which, at least for Stone, he is calling for this vision of an aesthetic evangelism, this idea of, in some ways, an evangelism that, whether it is right or wrong, may not be the question, but at least it's not ugly when it's actually exercised, would be one way to think about that. Does that make sense? Questions to that part of the book? No? Okay. Again, I'm deeply aware we took a week off. I mean, it's not like you read it and we dropped in. And some of you are just finished writing another report. So I'm just getting us oriented. I want to give you some background to Stone and kind of where he comes from and what has oriented this. And even this question of ethics. I'll mention something. I want to put this up so I don't forget it. In a way, Brian's work is a continuation actually of a book that was written, oh man, how far back was this? 1990. We're talking 30 years ago, by Roger Betzworth, called Social Ethics, an Examination in American Moral Traditions. And I will say the subtitle is better than the title. Social ethics is no more exciting than anything in the world. But Betzworth was really more interested in what is it about the narratives, as he would call them, inside the US that kind of create a certain way in which the preferred life looks, what the good life looks like. And in the book, he talks about 4 in particular. He talks about the gospel of success, the story of well-being, I always get one. I'm going to forget one if I don't pull it up here. The gospel of success, the story of well-being, and then the mission of America. And that one may fit here. And then the 4th story he actually spends time talking about, he calls it the outsiders. And this is when he deals with both African Americans and women who aren't always allowed to speak into these ones. I used to use this book a lot at the undergrad when I used to teach at Trevecca. And the one on the mission of America, he basically, the way Betzworth sets it up is that, and hear this language the way he's using. He says the United States has always been evangelical when it came to its embrace of democracy. Okay, so some of you may have heard the phrase "making the world safe for democracy," and what Betzworth writes about 1990 is he raises a conundrum, just a question. So, if you really believe in true democratic order, and you want to make that happen around the world, what happens when you hit a pocket of the world who doesn't want it? So do you find yourself in advocating for democracy falling into undemocratic strategies to try to compel it into a culture that won't embrace it to begin with? Does that make sense? And all the way back then, Betzworth is just basically saying, does the very means by which you're advocating something and trying to bring it into being subvert the message of what you think is important? Now, when Betzworth wrote the book, he had in mind, I know this is ancient history, but he had in mind Vietnam War. That was the approximate conundrum that the U.S. was in. And I'll confess, when I used to teach this book in the 90s, most of my students didn't get it. We were so past Vietnam. I mean, it was just, that's for old people. When this book finally started to gain ground again was after 9/11. And that chapter, even today, mindful of 20 years now in Afghanistan, and the lessons we have to learn from that, is the same issue that Betzworth saying. So the reason I bring this book up is not just because it's an old book, but these kinds of national challenges, these national traditions, continue to reinvent themselves from one historical period to the next. Does that make sense? And Stone is really a continuation of this idea that are there narratives out there that we find ourselves embedded in so that our witness is as much conditioned by those narratives as it is by the Christian narrative from that standpoint. And what do we do when we find ourselves in those places? Everybody with me so far? Any questions? So that's, in some ways, the narrative ethic tradition. I mean, this idea of understanding how narratives occur and then how to think about our ethical behavior in the midst of these has a long theological tradition. It includes people like Betzworth, Michael Cartwright. Some of you have heard the name Stanley Hauerwas, and they may have read some of his work. We'll talk about him in a minute. And Stone is within that family as a theological, ethical thinker. He wrote, his book is actually a continuation of a conversation between two books. The first one is Practicing Witness, Ben Connor's book, which I don't think anyone read. It was one of the missional disciplines books you could pick. I have to be honest with you, I was really surprised. That is the smallest book of all the books in the corpus. And none of you probably bothered to check the page length, or I would normally average about 5 or 6 people reading that almost every class period. It's like, I can read this in 2 days, it's that kind of mindset. But the other book that it's an extension of is actually Stone's own work called Evangelism After Pluralism. And so if you want to be thankful, I used to require this text instead of this text. And for those of you online, probably the best way to describe the difference is just to do that, right? So can you say, thank you, Jesus, that I'm no longer requiring evangelism after Christendom, particularly for this one semester?
And you have lots of marks in there, so.
Oh, yeah. I've worked this
I
book.
wish you had. I'd already read it.
Sorry, Alan. Well, that's also the thing. Stone's been around a while, but this book really is a clear extension of his writing in that first book. So if he intrigued you at all, this will be the book to go back to get an orientation. I'm going to provide you a bit of that so you don't have to do it all. But this is just a part of missional theology meets another theological tradition. In that book, basically, that text really is arguing for evangelism as a particular practice, but it is also what he would call a habitus or a way of being. We might use the language posture today, that is constitutive with this concept of witness. And so we do evangelism, but we live witness broadly. And the thesis in Evangelism After Christendom is the same one he has in here. If you remember, at one point he says, we've always had this kind of personal ethics and we have social ethics. And so when he says that, he has in mind books like Betzworth's book. But he argues for an ecclesial ethics, if you remember that part of the book, because for him, Christian salvation is ecclesial in nature. This does harken back to Newbegin's idea that the only hermeneutic of the gospel is the church. In other words, community defines that. And for him, salvation is our participation in and through the church. Now, that doesn't mean just one congregation, but through the life of the church, be it Kansas City First Church or other congregations. And that its shape is really a participation in Christ through worship, the shared practices, the disciplines, the loyalties, the social patterns of the body of Christ, the church. And so Stone has always believed that evangelism is fundamentally something the church does, and it's something, and salvation is something that's lived out in and through the church, Catholic, the church at large. Okay. Kind of famous throwaway phrases. There's no such thing as a Lone Ranger Christian, to which Daniel's going, Lone Ranger? And there's no good movies right now to watch around that one. But this idea of the solitary Christian acting on their own. There's a friend of mine used to say, so if a Christian was on an island and a Bible dropped down to that island, could they become a Christian just by reading the Bible? Well, that's the grace of God, yes. And the Bible might also kill them if it hit them on the head. But that is not how God tends to work. It is through the body of Christ, through the church, and its myriad expressions. And the faithful practice of the church is how salvation occurs, not just as a moment in time, but in the full transformation of a human being. So it's a broad vision of what salvation looks like. That should not, those who've had theology classes here at the seminary in one form or fashion have probably hit this kind of language before. But Stone is just reminding us of this kind of broader ecclesial vision of what goes on. And in that book, he also has rival narratives, kind of like, Betzworth in his book, or like Newbegin. And so in that book, he says the two things that tend to strip Christian witness has been either the Constantinian captivity of the Christian message. In other words, it got combined with some vision of empire or nationalism, the dominant culture, or its tendency to be reduced to merely a private exchange through modernity. That's in that book, he argues that out. In some ways, that is not that much different than the very critiques Newbegin's offering at the same time. That we tended to reduce the Christian faith to a private exchange between us and Jesus in a way that makes no space for the church, that kind of thing. Or we've attached it to the dominant culture, and we actually think to be a Christian is to be a part of that dominant culture in a particular way. Those are not new arguments. He's just reminding us those are persistent challenges. But he argues that the church neither can accommodate, in other words, it can't capitulate and just become a part of those. So he can't just merely adopt the dominant culture and say, therefore, you are a Christian if you are a part of the dominant culture. Or that all you need is Jesus and you don't need the church, or you don't need community as a part of that. But then in the book, he also says, but we also can't isolate from that. He's deeply aware of kind of tendency sometimes then to completely withdraw from the culture and just try to be a culture unto ourselves. Does that make sense? But he does argue in this text, just to let you know, that the church itself has its not only its culture, but he uses the language of social imaginary of the Holy Spirit, given to practicing the politics and the economics of salvation via practices that are by nature public in their orientation. We can unpack that a little bit. This idea of a social imaginary, he's borrowing from a philosopher. But it's this idea that people actually understand how the world works by participating within a community that gives them an imagination of what the world looks like as a result of that. Does that make sense to everyone? Charles Taylor is the person who kind of coined this idea of social imaginary. So it's not that we're just indoctrinated, but actually we have an imagination that's been fired by this kind of culture, if you will. And he argues that the church has that as well, but it's an imaginary of the Holy Spirit. In other words, it's not something we just sit down and say, what do we want to be? And we can create it. It's really following where the Spirit's guiding us. And so there are times when he's using sociological language, people think he is merely reducing, but actually he's trusting the Spirit to be at work in with, and through all of that effort. And he really is calling us to follow the Spirit, not to dictate. And then there's a particular way of living, and there's a particular way in which we experience, and those of you know the Trinity, when he uses the word economics, it is much like the economic Trinity. How do we experience the Trinity in everyday life? This is the whole, basically, the fullness of grace through the Creator God, through Jesus the Redeemer, and through the Holy Spirit of sustaining grace. And he is really saying that all of that comes in and through the church providing this, instead of just a hermeneutic of the gospel, but a really literally a vision of what the fullness of salvation should look like. And then he says every time the church baptizes, every time it serves communion, every time it worships, when it proclaims, when it offers hospitality, when it extends forgiveness, all of that is witness. So it's the church is public in its orientation. This has always, I don't experience it here at the seminary. It was always fascinating when I was at the undergraduate of people who wanted their Christianity to be a very small group, right? And it was just me and my 4 friends, and we would meet and we would know what the true gospel looked like or what true Christianity looked like, but nobody else was allowed to join, right? Now, I get that if you're in a creative access country, so I know the qualification of why you might want to be secretive in a setting where somebody's willing to have your head for your faith. But I think Stone's right that the church has always lived itself. I mean, it endured those martyrdoms. It lived itself out in the public sphere. And in the U.S., at least, one of the interesting things is the church is one of the few institutions that works so hard to try to get strangers into its doors. Mm-hmm. I mean, we publish times we meet, we publish promos. I mean, we run Facebook Live now. I mean, we want people to see the church. And Stone's saying that's exactly what the church does. Every time the church is being church, it is witnessing to the gospel. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And that embodies not only these sort of practices, but also virtues that call the world to conversion and amid similar invitations, and also demands a witness sometimes that is more like martyrdom. And in his book, some of you now probably know about the book, The Patient Ferment of the Church. It's one, if you've had a church history class recently, where the exercise of patience was a big part of the early church. But it's basically saying that the church lives out certain virtues, and as they live together and attain these virtues, they are truly witnessing to the gospel. And he has categories like presence, patience, courage, humility, and even what he calls common or ordinary living. So when we live our lives in just very ordinary, rhythmic ways, when we do that, attentive to the gospel, people see that in our lives. In that book, and I'm doing this in part because this helps to set up the one we read. In that book, then he says we cannot but help but witness. Now, what the quality of that witness is a different question, but we do witness it through the church, yes, but also through family, how we treat and live out our lives in family, how we choose to live our life at work, and how we choose to do that within community, being part of civic relationships and everything. So what Stone is trying to say at that point is it's not whether or not we should witness, it's we do witness. What is the quality of that witness? And for him, it's every aspect of our life. So you don't have a plan to go out to witness to people. You are a witness. So what is the witness that people see? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, in the book, finally people go, in this first book, they finally go, so if everything is witness and everything's evangelism, then nothing's evangelism. Yeah, Paula, let me stop. I'm sorry.
No worries. By the quality of the witness, do you refer to our Wesleyan belief of being like Christ?
Yes.
Being
Yeah.
okay.
So Christ-likeness would be a way in which we would say that, but I think the real uniqueness to this is even when we say being like Christ, which of the virtues that Christ lived out are we called to live out as well? And is it in Christ's love? Is it in his healing present? Is it in his reconciliation? Is it in his challenge? But is it a loving challenge? Those kinds of ways of asking that. And I hope you hear, Stone would say, and that's not only what you do to strangers when you meet them on the street. How do you do that with your family? How do you do that at the workplace? So are you being Christ-like in every dimension of your life? Because that's where your witness is. First, that's your prior witness, a priori form of witness. Does that make sense? And I think most of us know this. It's just that when you're picking up a book that looks this big with the term evangelism on it, you're kind of looking for something else. And so finally, there is a point in the book where people go, so what is evangelism then? Because he argues early, it is a very specific practice in the church, as well as a kind of disposition or posture toward people. In other words, so if I just go to work, is that all I got to do? And I'm just a loving person at work, that's it. I don't have to worry about it. He goes, no, that evangelism is also about enlisting people into this participation for the good of others as well as for personal salvation. So you're calling them into this particular way of life. And then you're explaining the implications of gospel participation. In other words, you tell them the why that they need to do this in their lives and the means by which, through the very grace of God, this is possible. Okay? But probably the difference, I would say, is that for him, the quality, and this is actually kind of closer to New Begin in places, the quality of our lives is the most evangelistic thing we do. And then the message follows the quality of that life. And we don't offer a message that is not inviting people into a particular way of life. Does that make sense? And that's why when you get to this book, this way of living in a pluralistic world becomes so important to him. And he then says that the challenge includes things like discerning practices of compassion, hospitality, of conversation. Talks about friendship and mentoring and moral leadership, that all of those things become very important. And I keep drawing the connections for the sake of our class back to New Begin. This is why New Begin, very late in his book, wrestled. And quite frankly, he was wrestling out loud in front of us. This is very close to one of the very last passages in here that was very close to the end of his life, when he's going, should Christians demonstrate some kind of control and authority as individuals? Now, New Begin is not saying, should the church take control? I mean, several times late in this book, he keeps saying, every time the church tried to take control of society, it did not go well. He's deeply aware of the Reformation and all the things that followed after that caused the Enlightenment to happen. But he is saying, if for each and every one of us, if we are in a place where we can exercise influence, authority, power, if you will, in the face of injustice and pain and suffering, should we be willing to do that? And Newbegin finally says, yes, we should. And in some ways, that might be the one place where for Stone, he's more indebted to a different theological tradition where he tends to want to not exert that kind of control from that standpoint. But he does keep trying to say that the most important thing we need to do is to see what's going on and then articulate the gospel implications, help people connect that in their lives so they can connect it back to the congregation. And therefore, they would be living into this life of salvation and into the life of the church. It's a really different approach than a lot of personal evangelism models today, but it's probably more of a historic approach to what evangelism looks like, where you live your life before the gospel. You then help people see the implications of what the gospel has in your life as a result of the witness they've seen. You demonstrate. And then you invite them into the very community that has shaped and formed you to this point in the journey. And in doing so, you're actually enlisting people into the church. You're bringing them in that way. And in some ways, then explaining why they would live this out in their own lives for the sake of the same process being done. Does that make sense? Paula.
Would you say that this is the concept that some pastors, some churches use as personal evangelism? We have come into this new era of personal evangelism, meaning one-on-one evangelism, then show a Jesus film and call it a day. We did our job.
Yeah, this is actually, in some ways, Jesus film is I want to be very careful I say this, it is almost a logical extension of personal evangelism. Because the idea is you can watch something and then through a gospel presentation, you can make a personal decision for Jesus and then you go on. Okay. And most personal evangelism models here in the US, so I hope you hear, I'm locating this here, go back to a gentleman by the name of D. James Kennedy in Florida, who built a model that was really built on this idea of asking sort of diagnostic questions about a person's individual life. The most famous one was, if you died tonight, would you know that you would go to heaven? Mm-hmm. And then, depending on that response, then providing a gospel presentation for them to make a decision for Christ in that moment. Okay, the strength of that. I mean, what I'm about to say is, in its day, it had a very particular purpose. This is always mindful of Guder, that in the day that approach was being used so powerfully, actually started in Florida during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so if you ask somebody in Florida during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's those of you who don't know that history would have to look it up, where they actually thought there would be a thermonuclear war started within the next 3 days in Florida. If you ask somebody, if you died tonight, would you go to heaven? That was something that was on the forefront of their minds already. It really was part of the narrative, cultural narrative that was going on in the US with the fear of nuclear war that actually reappeared during the time of AIDS, and frankly might be a part of some initiatives even today with COVID, for instance. Except we argue over COVID, so it's not quite the same thing. But it is very much a singular exchange between an evangelist, individual, and a person, so that they'll make a personal decision for Jesus in that moment. And the real struggle with that, I've known very good, and actually former professors here at NTS, Dr. Chick Shavers is a good example, and he's a friend of mine, who really does believe in this approach. But it is very individual. It is very much based on a crisis moment with a singular decision that resolves the issue of salvation. Dr. Shaver would say that leads you to discipleship in the church. But not everybody in the personal evangelism movement believe that. They just basically think once you've made that decision, you are saved. And therefore, you don't have anything else to it that is necessary for that salvation. As opposed to saying, no, salvation is a way of life that you live into. And this is more of a vision of transformation from that standpoint. Yeah.
Would we say, I don't know how to frame this question exactly, but it seems like with some of the personal evangelism like practices that have happened in the church in the past, like I have a grandpa who is a pastor and everything, and he still is going to the grocery store and talking to the grocery store clerk and trying to get him to pray the sinner's prayer while they're checking out at the line. I feel like the church has definitely gone against that to almost a point where we'd say that it's almost irresponsible to do that now, because especially with a complete stranger, because we're setting them up for something, but then we won't be around for the aftermath of it, I guess. And so, but I guess in the past, they probably would have just said, well, we trust that God got it taken care of after we walk away.
And in part because they trusted there was a quasi-Christian culture, particularly in the 1950s and 60s in the US. In other words, you would learn about prayer when you went to the dry cleaners. I mean, that sounds odd, but in a way, they trusted that there were social structures around that automatically, once somebody made a decision like that, whether you followed up with them or not, it almost was woven into the social fabric. There were ways in which they could be validated and brought into that. They wouldn't say it that way, but a lot of people say, "We'll just trust the Spirit will lead them," as opposed to saying, "No, it takes a community to raise a Christian." And I'm not opposed. I really want you to hear this is one of the strengths of missional theology that I have really come to appreciate, that Guder talks a lot about, is this concern of reductionism. So I understand why personal evangelism works so powerfully in certain periods in the church, that the Spirit was using that in a particular way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And in certain places, even globally, as conditions, not just because they're the right sociological conditions, but as the Spirit moves, why that might be really important as a way in which that particular way of describing what the Christian life, and the entrance into the Christian life might look that way. What Guder says is, but when you reduce to just that, and that's all you do, and because you grew up under it, then obviously that's what you're going to do. And these other things are not the way to do it. That's when I get nervous from a missional theology standpoint, because what you've done is you've allowed a way in which the Spirit maybe had worked in a given period of time that was true to that period of time get canned, and you then dictate how the Spirit's going to work at another period of time. Does that make sense? So a lot of times people go, are you just reducing the culture? And I'm going, no, you're actually limiting how the Spirit's at work. And it's a different, that's one thing about missional theology. You're constantly asking, but is there a different way? And is there always, and this goes to the other thing, is there always a kind of adaptation and then reformation going on, this semper reformanda? Is the gospel bigger and demands more than any one given approach in a given history or time? Go ahead.
As you were talking, I just had this image of because you said something about, for people who are raised under that, they're going to continue to do that. And I was just thinking, the church was also really, they have the song, I'm in the Lord's Army and all that stuff. Like the church was driving that into their kids too for a long time. Like even I was still a part of that, where I felt pressure to invite other kids to church and to evangelize to kids at school. And I feel like that's probably where a lot of the movement completely against personal evangelism is coming from, is that those kids who were pushed to evangelize even as children, and, that pressure to share the good news in their classroom and all that stuff. It wasn't bad, but it was a lot of pressure to put on kids, I feel like.
Yeah, and particularly if you, and I'm only because my field is Christian education. So if you brought new people to church, then you got an award for that. I mean, we did certain things in the church at times, and I'm going, I'm not sure whether this is exactly what God has in mind.
Yeah.
Now, Stone is just arguing that when the church truly is the church, when it lives out compassion, when it practices hospitality, when it does these things, it will be doing it. And you go, well, could that be a reduction as well? It might. So I want you to hear that. This is always about how the church understands its role in a given period of time where the Spirit is at work. And I don't look so much at with askance or dismiss periods in the past. Maybe because I'm now a person of a certain age, so I know that it's awful easy that anytime you point a finger, you got three looking right back at you. It's a friend I used to say. But I do know the danger of limiting what the gospel is about. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the great gifts of missional theology as a theological movement, is not that there's one right way to honor the gospel, but the gospel is too big for one right way. But to be mindful of where the culture is, what needs to be addressed within the culture, and calling them to follow the Spirit in a particular way. That to me is much more of a powerful understanding from that standpoint. I hope that makes sense. If there are big rocks that come out of this class, more or less a readings in, but an introduction to missional theology. This danger of us having not a God that's too small, but a gospel that's just too formulaic is one of the things that the missional theology has taught me. Because again, for me, the way in which he did evangelism in the ashrams in India versus what he was seeing in England, he knew there was a new gospel challenge, but he wasn't basically saying, well, we just need to inform ashrams. I mean, he didn't even fall back to the very things that worked for him in South India, but he was calling for a mindful, that's a contemporary term, but very much a very aware approach based on how the Spirit might be at work. Okay? And there's been a critique of the church growth movement. I was thinking, I think we were having this conversation. There's a book, William Abraham's got a chapter that tackles that in a book called The Logic of Evangelism. There was a danger in the church growth movement when it hit USA soil. It was this tendency to be formulas with a guarantee of success out of those formulas. I mean, it borrowed that consumer mindset as a part of its own enculturation. So that becomes part of it. Okay. I will mention this also. This is a little bit of an excursus, but I think it's helpful sometimes to know when you read somebody who's sort of shaping them. Brian Stone is in conversation with a different theological movement that's been extremely powerful from about the mid-1980s all the way till today. And the book, there are two sort of anchor texts that govern this movement. It's called post-liberal. So it is not liberal. And I always have to tell people, matter of fact, they don't like liberal theology as they define it any more than conservative evangelicals do. Now, they would often argue that sometimes conservative evangelicals are far more liberal by their definition than they realize. Okay. George Lindbeck wrote a book, and if you can get it, I would still encourage you to pick it up. If you can get it you can probably find it on Amazon for 50 cents. And shipping and handling. That's the bad news. Or you can find it in a used bookstore. I mean, it's just around. And in that book, he basically says that the way we tend to think of doctrine is either as propositional truth. In other words, these are true statements for all time, separated from context, or as an articulation of religious experience. In other words, these statements are reflective of how God has been at work within a person's life. And basically in that, all Limbeck is saying is that orthodoxy, and I would say evangelical Christianity, tends to be more toward propositional statements. And liberal theology tends to be more toward this religious experience component. And so conservatives really want to say, what's the exact right interpretation of the word or of a doctrine or of a theological stance? The idea that we can pull that truth out from a given culture and preserve it for all time as an abstract proposition. Liberals are always more interested in how is our faith expressive through experience, and therefore it tends to privilege the experiences of people instead of the abstractness of truth. And that's Limbeck's understanding of that. You probably have friends, even in classes, where you can hear whispers of these two movements. He argues for what he calls a cultural linguistic, and he's arguing that in some ways our theology, and I always have to be very careful I say this, not God's revelation, but our theologizing is always a cultural linguistic exercise. That we're born in a particular time and we find words that give expression to that in a very particular way. Okay. And so, and Daniel, I'm mindful you're here in the US taking courses here, but I have friends who have spent a lot of time, even for instance, talking about the relationship between the doctrine of sin and the doctrine of Han and how those intersect with each other. Where here in the US, if I use the word Han, we have no understanding of that the same way Korean culture does. Does that make sense? And then I'm theologizing then on how God speaks into the midst of sin, sometimes is deeply embedded with how we have articulated other aspects of what life is about, how the world works. Newbigin said it when he was when he kept saying, in India, when you use the word Lord, it's translated as Swami. And he was wrestling. So how do you talk about Swami Jesus? Instead of Lord Jesus, And he said, because it doesn't, the word just doesn't work in the same way. So Limbeck is saying we tend to talk our theology through a given perspective. We do. He wanted to use that positively to create ecumenical conversations. So Limbeck was very much like Newbigin. He wanted to say then that churches sometimes have theological statements that are embedded within their journey, their historical theological journey, and that they find themselves at loggerheads against each other. And he was thinking about Lutherans, and because he is a Lutheran, and the Roman Catholic Church. And he was trying to figure out how do you get those people having conversations with each other around words like justification. And Limbeck's book was a precursor to the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification that both the Lutheran and Roman Catholics agreed to. So this was profound work in its day and still is. What happened was that language was adopted by Howells and Williman, but they wrote a book called Resident Aliens, and they were really more interested in how then does the church generate a culture, and what is the particular language in the church, and why is that language important within the culture of the church? And so they were basically talking about what's the difference between arguing for one's rights versus talking about grace. And if you think about grace, how does that shape the language of rights? Does that make sense? And that's a classic example they would use in their writing. The other thing Limbeck was influenced by was the peace church movement. He is he basically believes in nonviolence. This is Brian Stone, and he got that through the writings of John Howard Yoder. Yoder is not that popular a writer these days because we've found some things out of his personal life that did not match with his writings, and particularly he was abusive toward female students under him, and which tended to kind of wipe out a lot of his vision of a peaceful kingdom and those kinds of language. Put all this in a nutshell, it basically is that liberalism tends to trust experience, and churches often cobble religious efforts with the dominant society. The government is our friend. This is why, and Stanley Hauerwas is probably the person to invoke here. You don't have to read Hauerwas. I do encourage some of his reading. And if you listen to him online, I don't have to own that. I'll just be honest with you. Stanley is a Texan. He's a Methodist, but he's a Texan, and he cusses like a Texan on a pretty regular basis. So I don't recommend, definitely for a church or a district gathering, that you use Stanley as the person that you're listening to for a presentation. He reads a lot better than he speaks at that point. But Hauerwas is equally an offender of what we would call progressive liberalism. All those people who want the government to do certain things for people, and conservative liberalism, who want the government to do other things for people. So Stanley right now, a good example would be if anybody's thinking the government's going to solve the COVID issue for the church, he'd say you're an idiot on either side of the coin. Mm-hmm. Because you're both liberal. You're waiting for somebody else to do your work instead of being the church. If the church is the church, we don't have to wait for any government mandates either to enforce masking or to stop masking. We don't pay attention to that. We ask, what does the church need to do in these circumstances? That makes sense? Mm-hmm. And Hauerwas has a whole set of social issues. He's an ethicist, where he says the church often tries to rely on the government or the dominant culture to do our work for the church. And he blames both what we would call conservative and liberals, progressives, of falling into the same mistake. So he's an equal opportunity offender. I do like that about Hauerwas. He has this ability to criticize everybody, but I also have a real problem with that because he doesn't always show a way out. Limbeck did. He said a post-liberal is someone who looks to the historic church and says, even over history, how has the church resisted cultures from defining it? And what were the strengths to create an alternative community by which people would live? Everybody, am I making sense? And in a way, is there a life shaped in a particular language from within the historic church? And for Limbeck and others, this is not just the church in the United States in the 1950s, but this is the church over time. How has the church wrestled with and tried to find its identity in the midst of different kinds of cultures, be it Roman culture and Constantinianism or other versions of that, even Martin Luther's reliance on German princes and the politics of that period. How is it the church constantly tries to resist that and still be the church, the body of Christ in the midst of that? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so it is an alternative culture, but it really does appreciate tradition. This goes back to Newbegin. It really believes in ecumenism, because it trusts that the broader witness of the church globally provides a better large vision than any denomination or congregation particularly. It's always in dialogue with this bigger vision. Okay? All right, I'm looking at the clock. I know we're at about halfway through. Any questions so far? Or concerns? Now, all this is going, for our sake, all of this is in Brian Stone's head. You might not want it in yours, but it is in his head, as he even wrote this little book. These kinds of theological conversation partners right alongside missional theology. And he wants all of that to be a part and parcel of what's going on from that standpoint. So in the book, and I think, if memory serves me, I think this is kind of completing a thought for us before we take a break. Yeah, at least a part of it. So let me just cover this one slide, and then we'll take a short break. We probably won't be here till 4:30. Probably no more than 4:28.
Oh,
So, just so you know, you get out early today. So I
Yes.
promise that. Rachel always loves that. It's like, I'm dying here. I want to go to bed. I'm sorry. My apologies. Okay. One thing I will say about the book Evangelism After Pluralism is that Stone has been conversant with missional theology. I mean, he understands that. But he is still indebted both to his theological ethics, and a lot of this post-liberal thinking is undergirding his emphasis on practice. And those two things are coming together. So you're getting someone who is not just a dyed-in-the-wool missional theologian, but someone who's trying to bring something into the conversation with missional theology and bringing with it certain theological frameworks. That's deeply Anabaptist and therefore oriented, both Yoder and Stanley Hauerwas's work. There are times in the book you might have been surprised. The whole chaplaincy thing is for him a case study. That's probably the best way to describe it. When he talks about the relationship between the church and empire and nationalism and all that, he just says, well, what about chaplains then? And he is really, I think I alluded to this before you read the book, but it is funny. He actually borrowed that from the book Resident Aliens, which it was from 1990 to about 2010, was maybe the most read book I knew by a lot of pastors in mainline traditions as well as students. And in that book, they reference, of all people, Henry Nouwen. I mean, how Henry Nouwen got into this conversation was beside me, except how Nouwen told this little story about a chaplain. And I may have told this story before, but I'll tell it again one more time. And the illustration Nouwen was using was a guy who was a chaplain for a luxury liner on a cruise. So we're not talking about military chaplain. We're talking about somebody who is on a cruise ship.
I want that.
And is chaplain to all the people in this luxury liner, and they're headed into really dangerous weather. And the captain summons this chaplain to the main cabin, and he says, "I want you to pray out loud that the weather will go away, so we don't have any problem. We don't capsize." And the chaplain says, I think my duty as a chaplain is not so much to be up here trying to pray and change the weather as is being with the very people who are on this cruise in their anxiety and need at this moment and trying to provide Christ's peace in the midst of this luxury cruise. To which the captain of ship says, you may think that's true, and you may even think God told you that, but I'm the captain of this ship, and I'm telling you, you're going to pray for this storm to abide instead. And Nouwen tells that story and it's a throwaway. Then he goes on. And that story has captured the imagination of a lot of people. So Hauerwas and Willimon use it, and it becomes a kind of metaphor that chaplaincy becomes this way of hand-holding the dominant culture and doing the dominant culture's bidding. Actually, they even go so far as saying whether it's trying to change the dominant, change the weather, change the social forces, or just holding people's hands in the midst of that. It's a kind of really diminished view of chaplaincy from that standpoint. Okay? And if you get really, Ken, I'm thinking about you particularly, but there were points when he starts going into his chaplaincy stuff, and you're like, I don't mind throwing this book against the wall. He's just wrestling with, is that all that chaplaincy is? Okay? And he does list the good, the bad, the ugly. Even the fact that, particularly in the military chaplains cannot be that sectarian. They can't even be that Christian if it's going to cause, and I've had conversations with military chaplains on this, if it's going to cause disruptions among the troops. So you are more religious than you are otherwise. And then he has that famous story that one chaplain who always wanted to pray in Jesus' name and got kicked out of the Corps and started, he's now on one of the YouTube channels. He's got his own video channel. But he's really wrestling with what is it when the church wants to be the church, but is so woven into the dominant culture that it finds itself stuck. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And for him, that is just a case study of what happens when you're serving a militaristic goal. Because again, his peace background, he has real problems with militarism. And I would say from his perspective, I would understand that. But even then, what do you do when you want to be redemptive in those situations? That you really do want to be redemptive. But basically, the Army says you can't be too redemptive if it's going to make somebody less capable for fighting from that standpoint. Does that make sense? And I know you're working with firefighters and others, but it'd be almost the same kind of thing. So how do you be a helping presence, but you can't take them off their assignment, their vocation, and their goal? I will go ahead and say this, and we'll take a break and come back. I want you to think about what might be a response. I mean, so what could we do for chaplains if this is a conundrum? I mean, what could you do if you are serving a military service that restricts the breadth of your witness, if you will, in order to accomplish cohesion in the unit so that they're better ready to do battle when called upon to do that? What might be a different way? I also will say that there's been a response actually written and published in Didache, Faithful Teaching. It's an online journal that I edit, by Jeff Spangler, who was a chaplain, a lieutenant colonel, until he retired. Now he's a pastor in North Carolina, trying to give a different vision than Brian Stone. I do know Dr. Stone. I think that case study has gotten him in more trouble in places than the book has. And Spangler tries to provide at least an alternative way of responding to that. Okay. All right. Any questions? You want 3:12? Are you kidding me? All right, let's take a 15-minute break, come back. I do want to talk about the books. I've got one more slide, and then we'll talk a little bit about the 3 books that you guys read, and we will call it a day, okay? So we'll see you guys in 15 minutes. It's now 3:12 by my clock, so I know that's not Rachel's clock, but that would mean, well, let's be back here at 3:27, 3:30. Let's be here at 3:30, okay? All right, we'll see you then. So I'm going to share a different screen for a second. I'm going to share my, the Moodle site. Make sure I've got that where I can get to it. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I think everybody can see this is just the Moodle site. Can everybody see that pretty easily? After last week, I'm serious. After last week, when you had 3 different links tied to 3 different assignments, tied to posting, if you really felt like you were doing aerobics on Moodle, welcome to my world from that standpoint. But we're wrapping up week 13. Next week, we will not meet in class. I'm going to say that again. We're not going to meet in class. We're back to where we were last week. There are things I'm asking you to do next week other than stuff your face with turkey, those of you who are big Thanksgiving fans, okay? Number 1 is to use the forum under week 14 preliminary research to ask questions of each other. So if you're working on your research paper and you are stuck about something or you're looking for an idea, post, and that means that we need to check that forum next week, okay? But it's a place for you just to post queries that as you're working on your research, if you need to do so, all right? And that might be a good forum to auto-subscribe to from that standpoint, but it's just a place for us to look for help with our own classmates. You don't have to, but it's a place to do that. And I would just ask us all to be mindful of that and check it a couple of times next week in case you might be helpful to somebody else who's writing. Okay? Then you will basically, on that same week 14 preliminary research, so on the same forum, you will post an outline of your presentation. And the instructions are there by class time, November 29th. And it should be a one-page outline that includes the thesis of the research and outline of the argumentation. And it just goes ahead and says to you, and oh, by the way, get ready to do a presentation on the 30th of November in class. Okay, so it's a prompt, but this is where you put the outline, not the paper, but the outline. Then you'll see under week 14, and you're going, this is so confusing, but I think you'll be able to do it okay. There is a place then where you submit the final paper for your class, for the sake of your classmates. Okay, and that one says submit the paper both in the assignments, which you go, wait, where's that? That's all the way, if you remember the way our class is set up, all your assignments are at the top under one assignments
That's
tab.
when I got confused.
So there is a place for a posting of the research paper, missional theology research paper, submit your paper here.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one I will grade. That one also goes through, turn it in,
Yeah.
so you get an originality score. And I just do that. I mean, every once in a while, I haven't had it in several years now. I have had someone really get caught in what I call unintentional plagiarism, where they would cite an author who was citing somebody else, and they would do a block component of that in their paper. And it's like double indemnity, because it comes off as if when you read it, it comes off sort of, a good example would be if they were citing something in here that Stone says comes from Newbegin, but the way it comes off, it looks like it's just copying Newbegin. Does that make sense? And so this lets you know sometimes, are you using the citations correctly? And are you relying too much on other people's ideas and thoughts and not enough on your own? So that's what that originality score is really helpful for. And I let you see it so you can resubmit if you need to revise portions of it, so it becomes more your language, not somebody else's language. Does that make sense to everyone? But at the same time, you put it into that slot up here under assignments, where you go, let me drill down again one more time. Then all the way back down, I gotta close the resources. I'll get myself in trouble here. And you don't see the PowerPoints. Okay. You also post it right there. And so that will be on, I think it's December 3rd. So you present in class, and then you still have 2 or 3 days before you submit your final paper. I keep saying this for a reason. I do this because I always hated to turn a paper in. I do a paper presentation on my final paper, get great comments either from classmates or from the professor, and I couldn't do anything with it because papers already been turned in. And academic writing doesn't work that way. I present at professional conferences, I get feedback, I get laughed at sometimes, but I get feedback from other academics about my writing, and then I incorporate that feedback into anything I submit for publication. As a matter of fact, I submit something for publication, I get feedback from the editor. I definitely may get laughed at that point, but I get feedback that I can adjust and make it a better paper. So I want you to be able to at least present the big rocks of your ideas and get some feedback before you hit that finalized version. I don't let you put in a rough draft of a paper. That's why I want an outline, because I'm not going to do fine tuning. But I want you to get enough feedback of your big ideas so that you can think about it when you write your final version, okay? So we will meet in class on Monday, November 29th, on Tuesday, November 30th. We'll meet our usual class time. Now, here's the thing. Yes, Rachel.
Okay, so I'm not quite understanding. So in this spot that's up higher, not the one you're showing now, but the one that's up higher for the research paper, that's the place to put the first one before the students might correct it. And then this place,
So let me clarify that. So the one that students are going to provide input in is the outline, the thesis and the outline. That's all you have to have. And it gives us a chance to give input into that before you write the very final draft. Okay. Now, the better you have written toward that outline and that thesis, I mean, the more work you've done before that class, the better the feedback can be, right? But my illustration is that people who actually write full papers do get feedback in academic circles. In our place, what at least you get to do is run your idea across the class, get feedback, including from me, at that point before you submit that final paper. Then, when you finally do write that final paper, that's due at Friday. I think it's Friday. Yeah, Friday, December 3rd. The same time you post it in the up at the top in the turned in, you post a version for your classmates down below. That's my second big belief. You don't do your research just as a private exchange between you and me as your professor. The ideas that you're coming up with, the things you're writing, should be a resource to each other. This is your opportunity to help each other out and provide ideas. I do not post your graded version for everybody to see, but you get to post your original version so everybody has access to that. Okay, everybody clear on up through our meeting the 30th and our final presentation, our major paper on the 3rd, right? Holly's going, help me. Right? I will put something in the forum, but I just want us to feel at least comfortable. That if nothing else, we don't meet next week, but you do have a place to upload your presentation paper or your outline piece, and then we do meet the week for presentations. You don't have to have your paper ready at that point. You can fine tune it up through Friday. Okay. What's important is we actually have a week 15, which is basically December the 7th, normally is when we would meet. That's the last day of class. It's not finals week, it's the last day of class.
Oh.
But you'll see that I have a second writing exercise that's due on December the 8th, that Wednesday, right? Which is a kind of summative essay of what's been sort of important in your understanding of missional theology up to that point. And I have guidelines on that I'll probably provide between now and then. But you're going, wait, I've got my major paper due on the 3rd, and 5 days later, I've got this essay. So when am I going to get to write that? And most of you know, most professors say, I don't care. That's your problem, not mine. I just assigned it, right? What I do is the last week of finals, we do not meet in class. Instead, I give you those 3 hours of no other time to actually sit down and write the essay. And so we will not meet the week of December 7th. We will not meet in class.
Wow.
Okay. Instead, and I'm literally, this is my covenant with you. I wanted to make sure I at least gave you 3 hours that you could sit down in front of a laptop and begin. And you may not complete the essay, but at least get the essay pretty well done. And that's why I do it that way. Okay. So it's valuable time.
Mm-hmm.
It's just me respecting how busy your life is at that point. So we only meet one more time after today.
Wow.
That's the week after Thanksgiving.
Crazy.
Okay. And that's to hear from each other and be done. Now, let me put my one caution in. That means that I will be a pretty heavy taskmaster on time. How much time you have to present, how much time for interaction. Because if we run over and at the end of 3 hours, everybody hasn't had a chance to present, and I'm mindful that we're missing 3 or 4 people today, but that we all can get in that 3 hour period, present, get the feedback, and be done, we'll be done.
Mm-hmm.
If not, then I have one of 2 options. One is to keep us over that day, which Rachel would go, Byler would probably be catatonic at that point. Or I could compel us to come back a week later to hear that other presentation. I don't want to do that. I want Rachel Byler to get her beauty sleep in. Not that she needs it, but just for her own sense of well-being. And 2, I want you to have those 3 hours to write. Does that make sense? All right. So one more get together, which is really to talk about your work after this class period. The rest of the time really is more to give you space for writing. All right. Questions, concerns? No? Okay. Let me stop sharing this and go back to so we finished. I finished by asking a question about, so what do you do with this whole conundrum with chaplaincy? Anybody come up with an answer? What happens when you are basically serving the government? That's just, I mean, it could be any branch of the military. It could be police department. It could be fire department. It could be healthcare services. So we're all talking about those. I mean, but you're always sort of balanced between the demands of that institution and your own set of Christian convictions for witness. How do you solve that? Yeah, Paula?
My thought is very simple, and I'm going to take what you presented in class today of the second book that Stone had.
Yeah.
To be a quality witness, meaning in the way the chaplain works and is through at work and his family and so on, because even though in the circumstance where he is, the place that God placed he or she in ministry, and there's some reluctance of what they're allowed to do and not to do, but if the quality of the person, if they live a really close life with Christ and put that a priority, those things will come naturally, that they will be able to be a witness to whoever God places in their life. I know it's very simple, but that's what I'm thinking, because I don't know too many chaplains, but I know what a pastor would do in that circumstance.
Okay. And often this would be the challenge for, it'd be the challenge for any pastor also who enters into those settings. Any other ideas? That's a good one, Paula. That's a good one. Yeah, Rachel, Hubel.
So I'm going to take the notes that Pastor Jason Hill has tattooed on my arms for the last 10 years and say, do no harm first. And that if you're harming your witness and if you're harming someone else, that's a place that you shouldn't go with your witness, and then do the most good you can do. So you can report to Pastor Jason that I actually listen sometimes. But that would be my answer to that question.
Okay. And I'll definitely say sometimes. So include that as a part of it. So, and again, it would be, how do you live this out? You would just live it out as faithfully, hear the language, as ethically as you should in the midst of the constraints that you're dealt with. So that is a very valuable answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
And this is closer, can you guess what I'm thinking? Because I actually have another slide coming up. Anything else that comes to mind?
I'll try to guess.
Okay.
I know when I'm at work and have a psych patient and something comes up, I'm like, I can tell you what I think. I can tell you the correct answer, or I can just not say anything. And usually they want the honest answer, and I usually give them the honest answer. But in my personal opinion, you have to really listen to the Holy Spirit when to do it and when not to.
Okay. So really to be attentive to the Spirit of God.
Yeah.
And I would say that's true in any pastoral practice, but definitely in that kind of setting. Kevin?
I would say a big thing before even going into the service is to really be grounded in your own faith and convictions, and live on prayer. Because of those restrictions, what it'll really boil down to is a ministry of presence. Mm-hmm. And with that, you kind of have to wear your faith on your sleeve, even if you can't use a certain set of language for the sake of the federal requirements. But you will also build relationships with the unit or the platoon or the people that you directly serve.
Yeah, including medical staff or police or fire staff.
So I think that's really kind of what it boils down to. But I also would say that there really isn't a right answer, because every group of individuals you're serving is going to be different, and every situation, because like even with this, is this just at a base during basic training, or is this active combat in Afghanistan, or is this in a Gulf base with the Coast Guard? So even in that instance, the way that the regulations will play into your ministry will change drastically. But I would say be firm in your convictions, live in prayer, and build relationships with those around you.
Okay. Holly, thank you. Kim, thanks for that.
If you're talking about the military, this could be an even bigger issue when you are pressed to serve multiple faiths and to be chaplains to multiple faiths. And then how do you, I know I'm asking another question, but I mean, like, how do you practice that witness of presence, as was just mentioned, while having to maybe perform the rituals of a different faith? I mean, that's hard for me to think about.
Yeah, and I don't know if I'll qualify this. I don't know if a chaplain is ever asked to actually perform well, they may be. I can think of circumstances. I can actually think of it in times of extreme need, where a chaplain might adopt practices of a different religious tradition in the midst of that moment. But whether that would be mandated is something you would have to do in chapel, say, once every quarter, I'm not sure of that. I think almost all branches of chaplaincy then say, this is one reason for the denominational endorsement or ecclesial endorsement. They want people who are endorsed that truly represent that religious tradition to represent that tradition well from that standpoint. But that one has been a struggle. I mean, Stone does include that as one of the conundrums. It's what happens when you are in a setting that is intentionally pluralistic. And I hope you hear this language. And it's not so much that it's pluralistic, it's that the needs of the unit or the need of the organization is to maintain equal validity for all of those for the sake of cohesion. So it's not, I mean, it's not the same thing even as the kind of dialogue that Nubian thinks about, where you might be in conversations and even listening to other religions. But it's really more saying you have to accept every one of those as a result of the institutional door. Can I run? Okay. I'm waiting for Kenton to leave, then I'll give you the answer.
Yes.
Somebody can fill in later. Okay. All right. I just for a second time, I am going to go ahead and show the next slide, and I'll fill Kenton in if nobody else does. The one thing that has been interesting that what has been suggested in 2 or 3 places is that maybe soldiers can serve, but not just with an ecclesial endorsement, but with ecclesial support. So the idea is then that the chaplain doesn't have to depend on the military or the hospital or someone else to pay their salary, but the church actually funds them in their ministry. They literally are a pastor inside there, and at least and they may still then work in very ecumenical, very collegial, very mindful ways that are respectful of others, but it's no longer based merely on the economic demand of the institution to hold them hostage. They're actually there as a missionary in the midst of that setting instead, being sent by the church and funded by the church. And it's a different way. I hope you hear that. I'm not saying that's been the right answer, but that's one that's been a fascinating one to think about. So very much like we do pay pastors who will visit hospitals and who will do those things. What if we funded missionaries to these institutions? And they would still have to address that same culture, those same expectations. It's just that they're not beholden to the institution alone for their livelihood and well-being. Does that make sense? Follow?
This is just an idea that a lot of people, including you, in the missional theology concept when it comes to chaplaincy, or did somebody actually did it?
I haven't seen an example of this. I mean, I think you could argue it from history. I mean, the history of chaplains is tied to, I think it's Charlemagne, who had his own official court chaplain. But there are times where people have actually served in carrying roles based on their ordination as a minister of the gospel instead of as a paid chaplain. So the ordination provides the focus of their missional engagement instead of just the endorsement of their vocation. Does that make sense? Now, I'm going to be upfront with you. I've run into this 2 or 3 different places at times in my own journey. But it's actually people a lot of times who've been in chaplaincy who struggle with this the most because of the close nature of how chaplaincy works today. It's just kind of outside the box. But it is an interesting way of thinking about it. Ken, what I'm saying is basically that chaplains continue to serve whatever institution as soldiers, but they draw their livelihood directly from the church. So that they're a missionary. And they might even meet all the restrictions and the expectations of a chaplain, but they do not have to have their livelihood directly connected to that institutional goal. And that one there have been times where people, not so much, again, Stone talks about the danger of what happens when you sow seeds of dissension by demanding your ecclesial view over against others in some of these places. But it is a way of saying you can offer a true witness and not have to worry about your salary in the midst of that. You can choose to do this in a way that what's the most ecclesially minded response instead of what's the best response from the standpoint of the military or the hospital. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. The other thing I have heard, and there are people who argue that basically how the chapel functions can really, there's been some discussion in similar ways, and this has really been, I think, a helpful way of thinking about it. Can the church be chapel around military bases? So there is a chapel on the military base, for instance, but do churches invest in those same soldiers, those same police, those same people? And the chapel is really seen as an extension of the church in a way of what the church does. And Dr. Steve Estep, who's on our board of directors here, when he was in Clarksville, Tennessee, they had 2 or 3 very strategic ministries to soldiers that they just took an approach that we can be a chapel as well. We can provide that kind of space. That I think is, so I have seen that. I do think, and I've already talked about the denominations paid chaplains. I do think this idea of responding to moral injury is something the church could really help. And I found people who are even closer to Brian Stone in their commitment to peace and nonviolence that have found very unique ministries working with soldiers who come back from the fields, who have been through so much trauma, and they are wrestling with the decisions they had to make. And to be a loving, peaceful presence in soldiers who returned from those moments. Even people who might be opposed to war, conscientious objectors, can be loving, reconciling, healing presence for people who have faced the ambiguities of those kinds of terrible spaces. And I frankly, right now, I would say that in healthcare, with all the people who've been working in healthcare, dealing with the COVID crisis, or police or fire. I mean, it's just, there are different ways you can be present with people who've been through traumatic instances as they have served an institution, and you can actually help them process that. Okay. There is one key question I want to kind of wrap this up that Stone leaves us with, and I think his approach to an aesthetic understanding of evangelism is, can our witness be both true and even good and yet remain ugly? And I think that's one that if you come out of the book and maybe you didn't like everything Stone had to say, which a lot of people don't. So, and Brian and I disagree at several points. And actually, I had the fun. Had the fun moment of actually responding to his bigger book. That's one reason why it's tabbed so much. And Brian being in the room, that was not a fun experience. But I do think he is really asking ourselves, what is the if beauty is a way of attracting people and not a commodified beauty, but just true beauty, is our witness beautiful enough that people see it as something they want to be a part of? I mean, it's a terrible moment to recognize that you can be right and you can be in the right, and yet you can alienate people in the way in which you are right and in the right in that moment. And I think Stone helps us recognize that from a missional standpoint, the quality of our missional engagement is just as important as that engagement into itself. Does that make sense? Now, I mentioned this last time. That brings us to the 3 books. So I'm curious if you have questions. We won't do small groups, but based on your reading of Practicing the King's Economy, Art and Soul, or Why Science and Faith Meet Each Other, I will say to you, I chose those books because of Stone's calling for the true, the good, and the beautiful. And I just thought, well, if good is basically flourishing, then economics is a field that missional theology ought to be engaging in. And if the beauty is all, then that should be there. And if truth is the search for truth, which is what science is about as well, could there be a missional engagement with science? So that's what motivated me to select these 3 books. So questions you had out of the readings of them or concerns? Never fun at 4:00. Yeah, Tara?
I'm reading the Practicing the King's Economy.
Yeah.
And this part that stuck out to me was this Jubilee, the year of Jubilee every 7 years. And of course, my mind immediately went to, well, what's the point? You just wait 7 years, you get all your land back, In a sense you do. But there's so much more to it. And God wasn't concerned about, if I understand correctly, he wasn't concerned about the big money making. He was concerned about more people working together.
And knowing that every 7 years you restore right relations
Oh,
to
okay.
every person in that. So it wasn't so much those who made money now had to give something back. It was those who had not had access now had equal opportunity to begin again. It's almost like a fresh start.
Oh, okay.
And there is something about Jubilee, about the idea of reconciliation, of the restoration of all things that's embedded within that Jubilee vision. So that it comes up a lot in the economic conversation from that standpoint. Questions or thoughts? No. Sorry, Lord. Is he going to say something I can include in the book review? So, no? Okay. This may not be fair. I mean, we've had a good conversation at least once already today. So why mess up a good thing? I do want to stress this about these 3 books. One is that in Practicing the King's Economy, I think you probably already know this, you could read about half that book and have a theological conversation, because every principle then comes with a practical theological expression. So that's why there's so many chapters, but there's really only, I think, 5 principles that you really have to work in. I do find it interesting that it starts with not flourishing or even equity, it starts with worship, which I find is an interesting way of thinking about what how could economics be to the glory of God? Most, and I mean this positively, most places working in theology and economics or theology of work focus more on human flourishing. And I do think it was interesting that they would start this book dedicated to the glory of God as a beginning point to think about what this is about. So it's more this aesthetic understanding of where it goes than the practicality of the outcome of people. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I think what's really good about it is, where there's so many prosperity gospel things out there and everything. The focus isn't on like what you get from the kingdom of God. The focus is first what you give. And I think that's a very important lesson that needs to be retaught in the church in a sense, because we live in a culture where it's very much you go to the church that gives you the most, and what can I get from the church? And you choose a church because you get friends there, you get, in some cases you get food there, you get all these things from it, but also in God's economy, it's about what you give. And it's kind of just that beautiful picture of like, when everyone's giving, there's more than enough for everyone.
Right.
And the less people that give, there'll be less for you to get. So, I mean, it's just like, it's such a logical thought, but it's like because of our self-centeredness and like this myth of scarcity that we buy into, that there won't be enough for us and all this stuff, it's something that most people are so far from.
Yeah. And most of that is more of a theology of consumption than it is a theology of economics as production.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that in our participation in it, there's more across the board than there will ever be from the other standpoint. So it's a good observation. Anybody else? I honestly seen the post, at least online, the fact that most people picked this book, knowing it was the biggest book. Even you probably didn't know that when you selected it, right? This is the power of Kindle. But it's a rather interesting book. Brian Fickert, by the way, is at Covenant College, Kings Mountain, Tennessee. And is a very well-known economist who's been writing in this area for several years. And if you're curious about this field, he's one of about 5 people that I see as a major contributor in sort of theology and economics conversations. So it's not surprising that Rhodes and Holt would reach out to him as kind of one of the big theorists that would endorse the practicality of their project. Okay.
I have a question. This is a general writing question that I probably should have figured out by now. But when you're writing a paper where like there's 3 people, 2 main authors, and then someone contributed to it, and you're citing, it's not like each chapter says this person wrote this chapter and this person. Who do you cite? Or do you cite all of them?
If you are, for the most part, because this one isn't, each chapter is not identified. This citation would probably be Rhodes et al.
Okay.
So ETAL with a period after that.
Right.
It's just a way of saying, here it's Rhodes and the posse, or Rhodes and the tribe. Yeah. For the shorter one, and then the full one, most of the time, even when they put with Brian Fickert, if you were to cite this and just put Rhodes and Holt, because they are the ones who really did the majority of the writing, that would be sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
They throw Fickert in the bottom because they know the name value of that. Sort of like the fact that Christopher Wright wrote the introduction. Mm-hmm. This is a publishing strategy that fed into that too.
You said it was Rhodes, ETAL?
Yeah, Rhodes et al. You can look that up on Google, but it's a way of saying that it's a multi-authored book. So you cite the lead author, and et al. Means and all that appear. So
That's a good question.
Okay. The Art and Soul book, did anybody read that? I'm just curious. I didn't see a post.
I was interested in it.
Okay. It's somewhere down the road. If you're interested in art being used redemptively, not just art aesthetics as a expression of evangelism, but how can art literally be used redemptively? It's a great book for that. The theology section actually is pretty much in one chapter. But then the expression of that, how it can be done both in outreach and in redemptive healing practice, the second half of the book's really good to see how has this been done in the art community. So I'll just do that. Paula, I know you did. I know you read Eklund's book on science. I didn't know. Did anyone else read that? Kenton? Okay. Questions or thoughts that came out of that?
Oh,
Go ahead.
go first.
Okay. For the most part, I liked it. I actually, going to my undergrad my freshman year, I was just told you just need a bachelor's before getting into seminary. So I actually went as a physics major
Okay.
before switching because it was way too much work for a degree I'd never used. But I really liked the premise of that. A lot of the breakdown in the dialogue between science and religion is just it's misplaced anger that's masking fear of losing the assumptions that we already have. And I thought it was really interesting to break down. I really liked especially the doubt and curiosity section, where it's basically broken down. It's like theologians and scientists use the same process when questioning things. But then we look at the other and go, well, no, it's completely different.
Yeah.
It's not.
Understanding how rationalities work, even if context shifts, is part of that. Yeah. Paula, anything from you as well? That's good observations, and I'll probably comment, but I want to let Paula speak first.
I enjoyed the book as well. Actually, I think I wrote this in my assignment that I think every pastor should have this. It's a great way to just be in tune with what's happening and what are the some of the conversations that scientists and Christians have. I totally agree with my friend. That those were my favorite chapters as well, curiosity and doubt. And I especially doubt because we use it so much in sermons with people. But what I thought that was interesting, and again, they spoke to American audience, and the fact that we are so eager to in Christian communities to not embrace some science behind climate change or other things, but yet we all take medicine and we just exclude medicine out of the science like that is a separate thing, because somehow if my kids know about the not believe in the what's it called, early earth theory,
Young Earth is how it's called, young Earth theory, but yes.
Young earth, then somehow they're gonna lose their faith. So to me, it was a lot of dynamics that played in mind of just how we should embrace science and not be afraid of it.
Yeah, and at least how might we have those really important conversations across the two disciplines. I will say Eklund is a sociologist. She says that she's not a scientist. What you might not know is she was a part of a major project that had quite a large number of evangelical scientists trying to figure out how to bridge the science and faith conversation. And she was part of that group. And so this comes out of it. And if you're interested, there was a whole curriculum that was designed out of it. And there's an organization, the American Scientific Affiliation, that is nothing other than evangelicals who are scientists. Or a better way to say it, maybe a scientist who possess evangelical faith in the United States and Canada. And they're trying to hold those together and support each other in it. The evolution question may have been, she introduces at the beginning because it's the big one in the US you have to get by. You just do. But then in some way, she is modeling missional theology because she's thinking about the context, and you can't ignore that. But then the creativity of thinking about shared values, and both in sort of in creation, but also in redemption, the way she organizes those, I think is a pretty powerfully missionally minded way of engaging that conversation. So I'll just say that. Some of you know I'm pretty active in the science faith conversation. I'm actually advising right now 5 seminaries in this conversation. So it's natural for me to include this as a part of what we do. Okay. Well, What time is it?
4:15.
4:15. I've got 13 minutes, right? I did say 4:28, right?
You did indeed.
Yeah, so I could hum,
Oh.
maybe sing a song.
I mean, what
No.
song you feeling?
Uh,
I can get you some background music.
yeah, right. Karaoke in a plastic mask is not going to work.
I mean, it kind of looks like those old 90s boy bands.
Yeah, with this thing, yeah, as if I could do this and get away with it, right? But you know, I one time did take a ball cap and flip it around to the back, and my daughter looked at me and says, "At your age." So I take instruction very well. I think for the sake, we've had a good, I hope this has been a good session. This is the last of the main sessions of information for the class. It's not to tie a bow around it because you get to do that in your final essay. So one thing I would challenge you to think about is out of all the readings, the different things we've engaged, what's been important to you? And if somebody were to ask you, so what is important about missional theology? You're not having to write an introduction to it. You've just been doing readings. How would you take what you've been learning in the class, and you'll do that in the final essay and sort of weave it together? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Holly, real quick.
I'm wondering in the research paper that we're doing, if the books that we have read in class do actually bring some value to it, if we can go ahead and include those. I mean, I know you don't want it to be like a
Yes.
critical book review, but
right. No, I mean, for some of us, I mean, this is where the framing of the missional theology has occurred in the class. So why can't it be a part of the resource? It's just that the paper can't be the book, just the books in the class. You have to do the research outside. That is maybe the one slide I will mention. And I've already talked about some of this, but one of the things I will say about your paper is just remind us we have had models of how your papers ought to function in the class. So if you're writing on something in Bible, Gorman has, I mean, that book is a model of how that kind of work would be done. If you are thinking about theology, well, Gator and Van Gelder and Sheely, particularly their first part, is a model of what that looks like, how you would do that kind of work. So think about it as a method as well as content. If it's church history, I know 2 or 3 of you had selected that one. Remember when I did that whole thing on what is historiography? And we've had 2 examples, Hempton's book, but also in that middle section of Van Gelder and Sheely, of a way of how you think about how you engage a historical period. Does that make sense? And if you're doing something a little more dialogical and contextual, I would just caution, this is not a how to practice missional theology class. This is what is the underlying theology. So the thesis, one of the big questions I always say for your thesis is, what is the one thing I really need to know or understand theologically before I can move forward and solve this issue, whatever the issue was that motivated you to do that? Does that make sense? And I think if you do that, I think you'll be fine. So if you're worried, this is why I gave you the form next week to reach out. So it ain't real until you start writing it, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, I know, professors, we've assumed that you've already collected all your notes over the last 3 to 6 weeks, and you're now in the first of your 3 drafts that you will have prior to your presentation, that you'll distill into your presentation, right?
Yes.
Or you'll be going, oh, help me, Jesus, 2 days after the presentation, one or the other. Yeah, Holly, real quick.
I am sorry to keep asking questions, but I was also wondering if you know what? Can I just shoot you an email later?
Yes, you can. But if it's a question you think might help others, I'll answer it right now.
Okay. I think I'll just email you later.
Okay. And if it's something I'm just going to be honest. If it's something I think is beneficial for the rest of the class, as I respond to you, I may just send it out to the class as a coaching.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, we always have these questions. That's why I have a forum for these. Is we always think we're the only person wrestling with X, when sometimes it's a parallel. It may not be exactly the same thing, but it's very parallel to what somebody else is wrestling with. So I want to honor that. Yeah, go ahead.
I do have one more real quick question, and that is in regards to this is my first research paper in this particular setting. So and this is just an approximation, like how many sources do you think that it would be good to have for this size of paper?
Somewhere between 75 and 100 would be a. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, Holly's going, why did he ask that? Everybody's going, why did you ask that question? Normally for a paper this size, somewhere in the range of something in the ballpark of 15.
Oh, wow.
But it
Okay.
can be closer to 10. I mean, a lot of it depends on the subject. This is why I have to be very careful.
Right.
That what's available. I mean, I'm looking at both Rachel Byler and Paula, and knowing they're working on histories of basically Christianity in other countries, and unless I'm going to get it in Romanian or those languages, it's going to be different. But make sure. My thing is, if I'm reading a paragraph and is speaking authoritatively, what backs up that paragraph from that standpoint? And that's an old one. If you haven't written in a long time, remember I do include a link on the Moodle to a whole set of videos I've done that you can watch on what makes for a good research paper, a good research argument. There's one video you might want to watch that basically are the classic mistakes people make before they turn in the final paper. So I've tried by video to coach a whole lot, and you can be selective in them. Like I've always said, and I'm sure Rachel Byler can attest, my voice is really good to go to sleep to. So you can watch them at night, and it's as good as melatonin. It really is if you want to get a good night's sleep. Okay, Holly?
I'm so sorry. I know I keep asking questions. I have watched them and I will rewatch them because I think they have already helped me and it'll be for a refresher. But I also wondered, like in one of the things you discussed, primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. And I'm not finding too many secondary or tertiary sources, but I do have some of the actual works of the person that I am writing a history of. So I'm wondering if I can't find that many secondary and tertiary sources, is it okay if I rely on primary sources?
You can. And becomes not, and I would say it this way. If this person is written like Karl Barth, 1,000,000 words, you might want to say missional theology in this section of the person's writings instead of all of the person's writings. So this is one of those strategies that could say, is there one area that person has written in that I think I want to analyze? And so it's only 4 or 5 sources, but you're having to drill down into each of them very carefully instead of trying to do everybody, all the sources. Does that make sense? And I do give permission if you can make the argument why those set of sources are so important, other than the phrase, and I've read them before. I mean, that's not sufficient, but beyond that. Okay. Well, it's 4:23, so I'm going to give you 5 minutes. Okay. Thank you, guys. Blessings to each and every one of you. Other questions, not just Holly, but other questions people have, reach out to me, send me emails. You don't have, watch the one video about the mistakes that can be made, because can you guess what the professor's thinking? That's one that I would say is mandatory viewing for everybody. But if you have a specific question, don't be ashamed. Don't be afraid to reach out to me. Just give me at least 24 hours to respond. Okay. All right. Have a good day, good evening, and we'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Blessings, everyone. Take care.